Hello and welcome to Becky Live. I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm Becky Andre, and I'm going to be your host for an intimate conversation about various leadership topics. So with Becky Live, my focus is to provide a few frames or ways of exploring the topic and to expand your awareness and your thinking. My hope that this isn't just a consumption of knowledge, rather that it sparks your thinking and you want to discuss with others around you, or maybe even share this video with them. Kind of a spark to generate human potential in the world, you might say. So the frames that I talk about are recorded and posted on my YouTube channel. The intimate conversation is not recorded and it happens when you join me live. So if you're interested in joining a live session, sign up for our newsletter to be notified or follow me on LinkedIn. And both links will be in the comment section of this video. And today's topic, ironically enough, is about frames. And so we're going to explore that and help you understand kind of what a frame is, which is, if you go back and look at my previous YouTube videos, I introduced a lot of different frames for you. And so now you're going to understand kind of how frames work and what to do with them. So I always like to kind of start with what we're going to cover for today. I'm going to cover what is the definition of frames. I like to go into kind of the source of the word and for us to look at it and really get grounded in understanding where it came from and how we use it today. I'm going to talk about how frames distort our view. And then I'm going to talk about how to engage with them. And I always think about frames as really helping us be better decision makers, be better collaborators, and to be better at coordinating multiple different perspectives, especially in a complex world. So it is a key element that can really help us as leaders become even more effective once we become aware of them. So let's move on to the definition. I usually look in two different places. So I like to look at the original source of the word. And when I was looking at this and getting prepared for the presentation, it was really amusing to read this, that it really comes from this to profit, to be helpful, to avail, to benefit. And definitely frames can help us do that. Being active, being vigorous, bold, going forward. And even like if you go to the bottom part of it, of the sense focused in Middle English, was to make ready. And I think frames really help us make ready to take some sort of action or to move forward. We're just oftentimes not aware of them. And then when I looked at Webster, frame really didn't have there was multiple kind of listing of definitions for frame, but really what felt more applicable was this definition of frame of reference, where it is really a set of ideas, conditions, or assumptions that determine how something will be approached, perceived, or understood. And this happens somewhat unconsciously and sometimes consciously. And so we're going to talk about those different types of things. So I want to start with a picture, and I want us just to conceptualize what a frame might be. And I want you to think about if you were the cheetah, what would you be thinking or feeling in this moment? Versus if you had the perspective or the frame of the wildebeest, what would you be thinking, feeling, or sensing, right? And so those are kind of the two things that we see immediately, but things that might be out of frame that might also have a point of view would be vultures or buzzards flying overhead. There might be microorganisms in the grass that maybe rely on either the feces coming from either of those animals or even the remains of those animals. There might be other animals on the periphery, but then you can even go much bigger and you can look at the frame from more of an ecosystem perspective when things kind of get out of balance, where the cheetah is keeping the population of the wildebeest in check and vice versa. And so there's different kind of frames that you can use to tell the story about this, all right? And then one of my favorite poems is called Autobiography in 5 Short Chapters. And it introduces how our frames change through experiences. So I'm just going to read it real quickly for you. So chapter 1, I walk down the street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I'm lost. I'm helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. In chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. And chapter 5, I walk down another street. And so the thing that I love about this poem is it helps us kind of see how our frames shift and change as we mature and as we have different experiences. All right, so we can see kind of this awareness frame changing of it isn't my fault. It isn't my fault. Oh, wait, it is my fault. And then I'm making different choices. All right. We can see some of the frames staying the same, that there's a deep hole in the sidewalk. All right. We can see the choices of the frame of I walk down the street, I walk down the same street, I walk down the same street, I walk down the same street. And then we see a shift. I walk down another street. All right. Now, sometimes these frames are unconscious. So and I love this illustration. Some of you will see a young woman, some of you will see an old woman. And once I give you the frame, you can't unsee the other aspect or both the old woman and the young woman. All right. So frames have this tendency of simplifying the world for us. But once we have a frame and a point of view or a perspective, it does have some limitations to us, right? So some of it is unconscious and some of it is conscious. Now, there is some real power to the frames that we use. So they simplify and guide our understanding of a complex reality. In today's world, oh my goodness, we have so much complexity. And so it helps us make sense of it. It forces us to view the world from a particular and limited perspective. And then we frame a problem, how we frame a problem exerts enormous control over the options we recognize and solutions we choose. So we can also forget that our frame doesn't capture all of the reality. So we can be lulled into thinking that our decision-making perspective is more complete than it really is. Frames draw our attention to certain aspects of a problem while they leave others in the shadows, kind of hidden from our view. And the frame and yardstick we use can drastically bias how we interpret information and what conclusions we reach. And oftentimes metaphors can be used as a way of framing things. And when chosen carefully, they can highlight important facets of a situation. But when one metaphor is used indiscriminately to frame all decisions, it limits the options that can be seen, and it possibly excludes the best ones from consideration. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about how frames distort. So frames filter what they see or what we see. They control what information is attended to, and just as important, what is obscured. So I want you to remember, no single window in your house can reveal the entire panorama, all right? Even just thinking about the images that we saw, you know, there are certain frames that are filtering things out. So the wildebeest and the cheetah, there were certain things that your eye was drawn to and that you unconsciously saw as frames, but maybe other frames might have been harder to see or even consider. Frames themselves are hard to see. So just as we have to step back from a window to see that it's there, we also have to step back from our frame to see what we're viewing, how we're viewing the world through a particular perspective. And frames do appear complete. They simplify the world, but they don't capture all of the reality. They leave gaps. But our mind doesn't like those gaps, so it tends to fill them in. And we usually don't even notice that anything is missing because the brain has been hard at work unconsciously filling in all of those gaps for you, so there's no anxiety or angst. And frames can also be very exclusive. We typically see one frame at a time. It's hard, after all, to simultaneously look out, windows on both the north and the west sides of a room. And it's the same thing with frames. Oftentimes we kind of get in the habit of seeing through one frame. And a good example is our profession, all right? So if you are in manufacturing, you're going to see things through that lens. If you're in continuous improvement, you're going to see through that lens. Finance, any other kind of types of function or domain, medical, is a frame, and it's helpful, and yet it isn't helpful at the same time. Frames can also be sticky and hard to change. So we actually get very attached to our frames, and we don't even sometimes realize how attached to our frames we are. And we come to depend on them to help us make sense of the world. And so changing a frame actually can feel like a threat. And when I get into some examples for you, I want you to kind of think about that, of how would you be feeling if I was trying to change one of your frames? But we do have these emotional attachments to these frames. And so frames can end up being very, very sticky and hard to change. And oftentimes that doesn't serve us well in complexity or when we're needing to adapt to situations. So I've kind of talked about what frames are, how they distort things, the power of them. Let's talk about how to engage with them. So we engage with frames by taking a look at having awareness first and foremost, and secondly is evaluating fit, all right? So we want to notice what frames we're using and what others are using. Now that's not quite as easy as we might think, but we can practice it and we can become more aware. And then the second thing is we want to evaluate fit. We want to ask questions to determine if the frame is effective. And I'm going to walk us through each of these just really briefly as an example. So one of the frames that I usually like to introduce into organizations as a way to understand frames comes from Bowman and Deal in their book, Reframing Organizations. And so there's lots of different ways and metaphors of describing what's happening within organizations. Bowman and Deal break it down into 4 different frames. Excuse me. They look at things from a structural perspective, that the main goal is getting things done, right? So the metaphor is more a factory or machine. We're looking at effectiveness and efficiency. Human resources, where it's more psychological, where we're looking at kind of how do we align the organizational and human needs. Then there's the political frame, where we're looking at developing agenda and establishing a power base, right? And politics can have kind of a negative connotation in today's world, but there is some really positives from that. That's really when you build a coalition and you build a power base, that's how big change is able to happen. And then there's the symbolic frame of creating faith, belief, beauty, or meaning. So the stories, the rituals, right? And within organizations, there are different frames that they privilege and appreciate. When I'm in a manufacturing industry, I'm going to see a lot of structural frames, right? And a lot of attachment to structural frames. And it's sometimes funny, as I go in and I look at things, I'm like, wow, they really need a symbolic frame or they need a political frame in order to handle this complexity that they're facing. I'm going to give you an example. There's a shortage of talent right now, all right? So while the structural frame can help, all right, because we might need to look at ways to be more efficient where we don't need as many people, or we look to automate, all right? But really the frame that they need to be looking at is the symbolic. How do we design work so that people are getting meaning, beauty, and belief, that their kind of inner needs are being met, so that they can't imagine, like it would be too painful to go somewhere else, right? And so, but oftentimes that symbolic frame isn't something that a manufacturing facility might look at. If you go and look at, let's just take the medical profession, there's a lot of kind of the symbolic, but a lot of it is structural as well, and oftentimes in conflict. And so it does create there's a lot of moral injury and moral distress going on because these two frames are actually in conflict and no one is helping resolve them. So frames, again, help us simplify the world. They help us move forward. But as I've said, they distort things as well. And this is just one example of frames. I want you to this might be a good time for you to pause the video. Or for those of you that are with me live, you might just want to jot down some frames. Frames can be our personality, how we see the world. Frames can be how complexly I think. They can be my beliefs. They can come from a country of origin or family of origin. And so the more we become aware of those frames, and so what I usually tell leaders to do is to play around with frames. Just start with this one. Just observe meetings, and just your whole goal is to say, what frame is that person using? What is their preference, right? And how many frames show up in this meeting? And what frames aren't understood, to just become aware using just one frame, one way of framing the world, and then you're going to begin to see others, all right? So then we want to think about evaluating fit. So I'm just going to stay with the Bowman and Deal of the structural, HR, political, and symbolic. Then you want to evaluate fit. So if we're stuck in this structural, we want to ask these questions, and there's others that we can ask. This is just a few examples. Are the frames easily communicated to and understood by others? Do key stakeholders accept your frames as a guide to joint action? Do your frames achieve sufficient simplicity without being too simple? Are your frames adaptive and up to date with respect to the changing times? And do your frames generate solutions that achieve the desired results? So if we go back to that talent example, right, the structural frame, if we're evaluating it, has limited fit in the way the complex problem is showing up today, all right? Better fits are HR and symbolic, all right, where those are actually going to generate some better desired results rather than the structural would do. So the biggest thing to think about frames is where are you coming from? How are you thinking? And I love this picture, what is the snake thinking? What is the mouse thinking? And it's more than just predator and prey. I mean, this might be a snake that doesn't actually eat mice, all right? This might be a mouse or a rat that knows or doesn't know that this snake doesn't eat mice or rats. And so there's always this nuance and lots of different things going on. So normally I tell you about the activities that are coming up. So we're taking a break in July. So we'll be coming out in August with our schedule and kind of what to expect for the rest of the year. So the best way to do is to make sure you sign up for our newsletter, which again will be in the comments section, so that you are the first to be notified of our schedule for the rest of the year. And I just want to thank you for watching the video. If you're interested in bringing frames into your organization with your leaders, I'd be happy to work with you and do that, and would be honored to have that privilege. I also would encourage you to follow me on LinkedIn, as I do a lot of different things there where I'm posting different articles or different ways in which I'm conceptualizing the world. And I'm oftentimes introducing different frames, different ways of thinking about things and seeing things. So for those of us live, I'm going to stop the video here. For those of you that are watching afterwards, again, I would welcome any questions you might have. You can send me an email and I'd be happy to talk about that. So thanks for joining us today, and I'll see you next time.